Well, let's get more on this now with Chris Hocknell, who's the director of 8 Versa, an environmental consultancy based in London. He joins us now from the British capital. Really good to have you with us, Chris. I want to point out some stark statistics which I've just come across. Apparently in 1950, the world produced just 2 million tonnes of plastic, and by the start of this decade, plastic production had risen to around 450 million tonnes, and we know a lot of that has ended up as plastic pollution in our rivers, waterways and oceans. Just describe to us how bad this problem is right now.
Yes, well, it is an increasing problem, and it has got, as you mentioned, increasingly worse. And the projections are by 2050, that rate of increase will continue. The reality is that a lot of the European countries and Japan and South Korea, for example, the richer countries, they've managed to implement infrastructure and broader kind of systemic solutions to it, but we still have this fundamental issue, largely in Asia. So around 90% of the ocean plastic pollution actually comes from from Asia. We really have this fundamental lack of infrastructure in almost every respect.
Yes, as you say, there is this stark divide between the developed and developing world in terms of how they deal with plastic pollution. Do you then think it's perhaps the responsibility of richer nations to help out their poorer neighbours to deal with this scourge?
I think the focus probably needs to be put on the producers of the products themselves and the materials themselves. So I think where we have seen the most success is where there are surcharges or there are some kind of taxes through a regulatory system placed on the producers of these materials and the sellers of the products themselves. I mean, fundamentally, we're really suffering from a complete, when I say a lack of infrastructure, that's physical infrastructure, as in collections, bins, waste management practices, but it's actually also regulatory and also financial. So there are many incentives and regulatory structures, which is how this has been dealt with primarily in, say, Europe and Canada and Japan and the richer parts of Asia. There's been large regulatory infrastructure put in place, forcing organisations to do this and charging for volumes or sale volumes of plastic itself. Now, without that, you're on a losing game, because this stuff isn't excessively expensive, but without the regulatory infrastructure and that incentive, it's going to keep happening. So it's a matter of physical infrastructure, regulation, and then financial incentives as well.
Here in Turkey, the government has implemented a zero waste initiative across the country. You know, other countries have similar schemes in place. Describe to us, where are we seeing best practice in terms of dealing with plastic waste and pollution?
There's been a few really good examples, actually. So I think one which is quite relevant to, say, Pakistan, which is the approach that Brazil has taken. So the previous segment mentioned informal waste pickers, and obviously these are people who pick up waste and deal with it for some kind of basic financial incentive. You can take that informal sector and formalise it, so you can set up cooperatives and create government contracts, which should be funded by the organisations that are producing plastic themselves, and you can turn that into a very viable model, which is incredibly cheap, and it's much cheaper than doing the end of pipe. Indonesia also has a much better approach than a very low cost approach. You know, for example, I think it has hundreds of those river collectors. So these are actually quite cheap. These can be, say, $50,000 or $100,000 to set up, and they catch 50 or 100 tons of waste a day in the big major rivers. And this is really simple stuff. Fundamentally, it's actually this issue of plastic pollution is actually from a technical perspective, it's a relatively simple problem. There's there's companies fighting regulation, and there aren't simple financial infrastructure in place. But deposit schemes and things like that are the ones that have been used in, say, Germany, for example, where you get 25 cents for a plastic bottle that's returned. That's not going to work in some of these countries, given the purchasing power, etc. But we can look at, say, Indonesia and Brazil as examples of taking simple solutions or informal solutions, formalizing them, and then adding incentives, day payments for these activities, and turning it into a way for people to actually make a living.
Okay, Chris Hocknell, we'll leave it there for now. Thanks so much for joining us on the programme.